"Dad, just sign the papers." Those were the last calm words my daughter said to me before I hit the cold marble stairs of a hotel in Florence. 1 second, I was standing there staring at Olivia Bennett with my room keys still in my hand, and the next I was grabbing for a railing that wasn't there. I still remember the sound of my own breathing echoing through that empty stairwell while my daughter looked down at me with eyes I didn't recognize anymore. "You're being dramatic," she snapped as I struggled to sit up. Her husband Ethan grabbed her arm and whispered, "We need to go. Right now." Then they left me there, alone, bleeding through my white dress shirt in a foreign country nearly 5,000 miles from my home in Napa Valley. I wish I could tell you that was the moment my family fell apart, but the truth is my family had already been breaking for years. Before I tell you what really happened to me in Italy, I want to ask you something. If this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with your whole life, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And please tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I read those comments every night because during the darkest nights of my life, strangers showed me more kindness than my own family ever did. My name is Richard Bennett. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of the night my daughter tried to erase me so she could take everything I built. It all started 3 days earlier, when Olivia insisted our family celebrate my birthday in Italy. "Dad, you've spent your whole life working," she told me over the phone. "Let us do something nice for you for once." I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw Ethan's face at the airport in Rome. My son-in-law smiled too quickly, shook my hand too hard, and kept asking strange questions about my estate attorney back in California. "Still handling all your business through that same trust?" he asked while we loaded luggage into a black SUV. I laughed awkwardly and said, "You sound more interested in my paperwork than my birthday." Ethan looked away immediately. Olivia did too. That silence sat in the car with us all the way to Florence. By the second night, I started noticing little things. Olivia constantly checking her phone. Ethan disappearing for long private calls. Conversations stopping the second I walked into the room. Then came dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Arno River. Candlelight flickered across Olivia's face while she swirled red wine in her glass without taking a sip. "Dad," she finally said softly, "have you ever thought about simplifying things?" "Simplifying what?" I asked. "The vineyard, the land, the business." I leaned back slowly. "Bennett Hills isn't something you simplify." Ethan forced a smile. "She's just saying maybe it's time to think about retirement." I stared at both of them for several seconds before answering. "I built that vineyard with your mother before either of you could afford your own rent." Olivia's expression changed instantly. "And maybe that's the problem," she said coldly. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. "It means you care more about dirt and grapes than your own family." The table went silent. A waiter approached nervously with another bottle, then quietly backed away after seeing Olivia's face. "That vineyard is the only reason this family ever had anything," I told her. "No," Olivia whispered while staring directly into my eyes. "That vineyard is the reason none of us were ever enough for you." I didn't sleep that night. Around 2 a.m., I heard Ethan and Olivia arguing through the hotel wall. I couldn't hear every word clearly, but one sentence cut through the silence like broken glass. Ethan hissed, "If he changes his mind now, we lose everything." The next morning, Olivia acted perfectly normal. Too normal. She hugged me at breakfast, smiled for pictures, called me daddy like she used to when she was little. But her hands were shaking when she poured coffee. Then later that evening, she knocked on my hotel room door holding a folder against her chest. "Dad," she said quietly, "there's something we need to discuss before we go home." And when I looked down at the papers inside that folder, I realized my daughter hadn't brought me to Italy for my birthday at all. The folder in Olivia's hands contained transfer documents for Bennett Hills Vineyard, complete with highlighted signature tabs already marked for me in yellow. I remember staring at those papers while the hallway lights above us hummed softly in the silence. "You brought legal documents to my birthday trip?" I asked quietly. Olivia crossed her arms defensively. "Dad, do not make this harder than it needs to be." I looked past her toward Ethan, standing near the elevator pretending not to listen. That was when something cold settled deep in my chest, because suddenly all the strange little moments over the past few years began lining up perfectly in my mind. People always assume betrayal arrives suddenly like a lightning strike, but it does not. Most of the time, it grows slowly inside ordinary moments until one day you realize the people you love stopped seeing you as family a long time ago. Olivia was not always like this. When she was 8 years old, she used to run barefoot between the vineyard rows carrying a little wicker basket bigger than her torso. Her blonde hair would bounce in the California sunlight while she shouted, "Dad, look how many grapes I picked." Her mother Caroline would laugh from the porch and tell me, "That little girl worships you." Back then I believed nothing could ever break us apart. But after Caroline died from breast cancer 15 years ago, something changed inside our family. Grief does strange things to people. My son Daniel became quieter and more protective of me, while Olivia became angry at the entire world. At first I excused it because she was hurting. She dropped out of college for a semester, started dating men who treated her badly, called me crying at 2 in the morning asking for money. And every single time I helped her, "Dad, I just need a little support until I get back on my feet." Of course, I always answered, "You are my daughter." I paid off her credit card debt twice before she turned 30. I covered the down payment on her first condo in San Diego. When Ethan's failed restaurant left them drowning in debt, I quietly wired them $180,000 without telling Daniel because I did not want Olivia to feel embarrassed. But no matter how much I gave her, it never seemed to heal whatever resentment had been growing inside her. One Thanksgiving about 6 years ago, I remember Daniel helping me carry wine crates into the cellar while Olivia sat inside scrolling through her phone. "You always treat him like the golden child," she snapped out of nowhere during dinner. Everyone froze. Even my granddaughter Sophie stopped eating mashed potatoes and looked up nervously. "What are you talking about?" I asked her. Olivia laughed bitterly. "Daniel works one harvest season, and suddenly he is the loyal son." Daniel immediately shook his head. "Liv, come on. Dad has helped both of us." But Olivia pointed directly at the vineyard through the dining room window. "You already know he is giving all of this to you someday." Caroline's empty chair still sat at the end of that table back then, and I remember staring at it while trying to keep my voice calm. "This family is not a competition," I told her. "Then why does it always feel like I am losing?" she whispered. That question haunted me for years because part of me wondered if maybe I had failed her somehow. Maybe I spent too much time building the vineyard after Caroline died. Maybe I missed signs I should have seen earlier. Maybe Olivia did not hate the vineyard at all. Maybe she hated the fact that it survived while her mother did not. But over time her sadness slowly transformed into entitlement. Every visit became about money, ownership, or inheritance. Ethan fueled it constantly. A smart family plans ahead, he once told me while pouring himself 12-year-old whiskey from my cabinet without asking. Especially when assets are involved. Assets. Not memories. Not legacy. Assets. The final crack came 8 months before Italy when Olivia walked into my office at Bennett Hills and casually asked for access to company financial records. "Why would you need that?" I asked. She smiled too quickly. "I'm just trying to learn the business." But when I refused, her entire expression darkened for half a second before she recovered. It was brief, almost invisible, but I saw it. And standing there in that Florence hotel hallway with transfer papers in my hands, I suddenly realized that moment in my office had not been curiosity at all. It had been the beginning of a plan. Olivia kept the folder pressed tightly against her chest while we stood outside my hotel room in Florence. "Dad, you are overthinking this," she said softly. "These documents are just temporary protections in case something happens to you." I looked down at the signature tabs again, then slowly flipped through the pages one by one. Temporary protections. That was an interesting way to describe permanent transfer clauses. Ethan finally walked over from the elevator and gave me the same polished smile he used whenever he wanted something from me. "Richard, nobody is trying to take anything away from you," he said. "This is about preserving the family legacy." For years that kind of language worked on me because I hated conflict inside my family. I would usually sigh, apologize for being suspicious, and try to smooth things over before dinner got uncomfortable. But something inside me felt different that night. Maybe it was the way Olivia avoided eye contact. Maybe it was the fact that Ethan already had a pen ready in his jacket pocket before I even answered. Or maybe deep down I had finally grown tired of being treated like an old man too confused to notice what was happening around him. I closed the folder carefully and handed it back to Olivia. "No," I said calmly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the marble walls around us. Olivia blinked at me like she had not heard correctly. What do you mean no? She asked. I mean I am not signing anything. Ethan laughed awkwardly. Come on, Richard. Let us not turn this into a big emotional situation. That word emotional irritated me more than it should have. You flew me across the Atlantic Ocean with legal paperwork hidden in your suitcase, I replied. Do not lecture me about emotional situations. Olivia's face tightened immediately. You always do this, she snapped. Every time somebody questions you, you act like the victim. In the past, I probably would have apologized just to keep peace in the family, but I did not apologize this time. I simply stared at my daughter quietly while years of little moments replayed in my mind like pieces finally connecting together. The strange phone calls, the pressure, the entitlement, the constant obsession with ownership. Good night, Olivia, I said finally. Then I walked into my room and closed the door. That was the first time in years I did not give my daughter what she wanted, and I think it frightened her. I barely slept that night. Around dawn, I stepped onto the small balcony outside my room overlooking Florence. Church bells echoed through the early morning air while sunlight slowly touched the old terracotta rooftops. Normally moments like that brought me peace, but my stomach felt tight with unease. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Daniel calling from Napa Valley. Hey, Dad, he said warmly. How is Italy? Just hearing my son's voice relaxed me slightly. Beautiful city, I answered. Strange trip. Daniel hesitated. Olivia has been acting weird lately. I stayed quiet. Then he added carefully. A few weeks ago, she asked me questions about the Vineyard ownership structure. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of questions? Stuff about trusts. Voting rights. What happens if you retire? Daniel paused. Dad, is everything okay? I looked out over Florence while people below carried coffee cups through narrow streets that had existed for centuries before any of our family drama ever began. I am not sure anymore, I admitted. Later that afternoon, we toured a private vineyard outside the city. The owner, an older Italian man named Marco Bellini, walked us through rows of Sangiovese grapes while explaining harvest conditions. At one point, he smiled at me and said, Your daughter tells me she will soon take over your winery in California. I stopped walking immediately. Olivia's expression froze. Ethan quickly jumped in. Future planning, he said with a laugh. Family business conversations. But I noticed something important in that moment. Olivia was not imagining a future where we worked together. In her mind, I was already gone. During lunch, Marco asked me how long I had owned Bennett Hills Vineyard. 38 years, I answered proudly. Marco nodded with respect. Then you understand something many younger people do not, he said. A vineyard is not money. It is blood and time. Olivia looked down at her wine glass without speaking. And for the first time since arriving in Italy, I saw something dangerous hiding underneath her silence. Not sadness, not frustration, desperation. That evening when we returned to the hotel, I found Ethan alone in the lobby speaking angrily into his phone. He did not see me standing there near the staircase. I do not care what the bank said, he hissed quietly. We need another extension. Then his voice dropped lower. Once the transfer is done, all of this disappears. My blood ran cold because suddenly I realized this was no longer just about greed. Something much bigger was collapsing around them, and somehow my vineyard had become their escape plan. That night, I could not stop thinking about Ethan's phone call in the hotel lobby. I sat alone in my room staring at the lights of Florence outside my window, while every instinct inside me screamed that something was deeply wrong. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. Can we please talk tomorrow without fighting? I stared at the message for several seconds before typing back. We were never fighting, Olivia. I was asking questions. She never replied. The next morning, the tension between us felt thick enough to taste. We met downstairs for breakfast inside the hotel restaurant where tourists laughed over cappuccinos while my family sat in silence like strangers trapped together. Ethan kept checking his watch every few minutes. Olivia barely touched her food. Finally, she leaned toward me and lowered her voice. Dad, there are some things happening that you do not understand. Then explain them, I answered calmly. She exchanged a quick glance with Ethan before speaking again. We are under pressure financially. I nodded slowly. How much pressure? Ethan immediately cut in. Temporary setbacks. Nothing serious. But Olivia looked exhausted in a way makeup could not hide anymore. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes and her hands trembled slightly when she lifted her coffee cup. The restaurant losses were worse than we expected, she admitted quietly. And then the investment property in Scottsdale collapsed. I frowned. You told me that property was profitable. Ethan forced a laugh. Real estate markets shift. How much do you owe? I asked directly. Neither of them answered. That silence told me everything. My stomach tightened. Jesus Christ, I whispered. Olivia suddenly leaned closer across the table. Dad, if you transfer the vineyard temporarily, we can leverage the equity, restructure everything, and stabilize before anybody gets hurt. Anybody gets hurt. Those words stayed with me because she did not sound like a daughter asking for help anymore. She sounded like somebody trying to stop a disaster already in motion. No, I said firmly. Olivia's expression hardened instantly. You would really let your own daughter drown? Do not turn this into emotional blackmail, I replied quietly. Ethan slammed his coffee cup down harder than he intended, drawing glances from nearby tables. You have no idea how much pressure we are under, he muttered. Then maybe you should have thought about that before gambling your future on risky deals, I answered. The second those words left my mouth, Ethan's entire face changed. Cold, angry, cornered. Olivia immediately stood up. Can we not do this here? She whispered sharply. But it was already too late. For the first time I realized they were not asking me for support. They were depending on me to save them completely. And somewhere along the line they had convinced themselves they were entitled to it. The rest of that afternoon became strangely performative. Olivia acted cheerful during the city tour. Ethan cracked forced jokes. They took smiling family photos beside the Ponte Vecchio, while tension quietly rotted beneath every conversation. At one point, Olivia wrapped her arm around mine for a photograph and whispered through clenched teeth, "You are making this harder than it has to be." I looked at my daughter carefully. No, Olivia. Life is making this harder. I am simply refusing to lie to myself anymore. Her smile stayed, frozen for the camera, but I felt her grip tighten painfully against my arm. Later that evening, I called my attorney back in Napa from the hotel room bathroom, while running the sink water to avoid being overheard. Martin, I said quietly, I need you to tell me if anybody has contacted the office asking questions about my estate. There was a long pause. Actually, he admitted carefully, Olivia called twice last month requesting information about ownership transfer procedures. My chest tightened. Did you give her anything? Absolutely not, Martin answered. But Richard, there is something else. I gripped the edge of the sink. What? A private lender from Los Angeles contacted us 3 weeks ago asking whether Bennett Hills Vineyard was protected under an irrevocable trust. My blood turned cold. Why would a lender ask that? Martin hesitated before answering. Because somebody may have already used your estate as collateral in financial discussions. I felt the room spin slightly beneath me. My daughter had not only been planning behind my back. She had been building an entire story around assets she did not even own yet. And somehow other people already believed she would soon control everything. When I walked out of the bathroom, Olivia was standing silently inside my hotel room waiting for me. The folder was back in her hands. Dad, she said softly, we are running out of time. And in that moment, I realized the danger surrounding me was far worse than I had imagined. Olivia stood inside my hotel room, holding that folder like it contained oxygen. The Florence rain tapped softly against the balcony doors while neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she placed the documents carefully on the desk beside my laptop. Dad, she said quietly, if we do not solve this now, everything is going to collapse. I stared at her. Then tell me the truth for once. Her eyes filled with frustration immediately. You always say that like I am some criminal. Because honest people do not secretly build financial plans around property they do not own. Ethan entered the room behind her before she could answer. This conversation is getting toxic, he muttered. Toxic. That word almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because I had spent years watching my own family slowly redefine manipulation as concern and greed as survival. How much debt are you in? I asked again. Ethan folded his arms. Enough that we need solutions instead of lectures. Olivia stepped closer toward me. Please, she whispered. You have more than enough. You would barely notice the difference. That sentence hurt more than she realized because Bennett Hills Vineyard was never just money to me. It was 38 years of 12-hour harvest days under California heat. It was my late wife Caroline standing beside me at midnight bottling wine with stained purple hands while old country music played through dusty speakers. It was every mortgage payment we barely survived, every frost season, every employee who trusted me to keep their families fed. But standing there in that hotel room, my daughter reduced all of it to excess wealth she felt entitled to access. "No," I said one final time. Olivia's face changed completely then. Something inside her shut off emotionally. "Fine," she said coldly. "Do not say we did not try." The next 48 hours became a blur of pressure from every direction. Ethan started sending me lengthy text messages filled with legal language about succession planning and family responsibility. Olivia emailed me emotional letters talking about preserving unity and protecting future generations. At one point, she even slid a handwritten note beneath my hotel room door that read, "Mom would not want this family torn apart." That line sat in my chest like poison because Caroline's memory had quietly become a weapon in this situation. Then the phone call started. First, it was my cousin Walter back in Sacramento. "Richie," he said carefully over the phone, "Olivia told us you have been having memory problems lately." I sat upright immediately. "What?" Walter hesitated awkwardly. "She said you have been forgetting financial decisions and refusing help." My heart dropped. "Walter, that is not true. I figured something sounded strange," he admitted. But she sounded very convincing. The next call came from an old family friend named Susan Harper. "Richard," she said gently, "Olivia is worried about you traveling internationally in your condition." My condition? I felt physically sick hearing those words because suddenly I understood what they were doing. They were creating a story around me before I even returned home. A story where I was confused, emotional, unstable, difficult. The worst part was how believable it sounded because people naturally assume aging means decline. Nobody questions it at first. That realization terrified me more than the financial pressure itself. Back in Napa, even a few Vineyard employees started acting strangely after Olivia called the office several times. Daniel phoned me one evening sounding exhausted. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" he asked quietly. "Olivia told half the family you are refusing medical evaluations." I closed my eyes. "Do you believe her?" There was a pause. "No," he answered firmly. "But other people do." That sentence stayed with me all night. Other people do. I spent hours trying to repair the damage. I called relatives personally, sent emails clarifying the lies, left voicemails for business contacts. Every conversation felt humiliating because I sounded like a man defending his own sanity against whispers spreading quietly behind his back. Meanwhile, Olivia stopped answering my calls entirely. Ethan only responded with cold, professional text messages. "We are trying to help you avoid future complications. Your resistance is creating unnecessary stress. Please think rationally." Rationally, as if refusing to surrender everything I built somehow made me unreasonable. Late on the final night in Florence, I sat alone in the hotel lounge listening to distant piano music while tourists laughed around me, completely unaware that my entire family life was collapsing in slow motion. I checked my phone one last time hoping Olivia had finally messaged me something honest. Instead, I found a new email forwarded accidentally from Ethan to Olivia. The subject line read, "Once he signs, the bank releases the hold." And beneath it was a number large enough to explain every desperate look I had seen in their eyes. I sat alone in that Florence hotel lounge long after midnight, staring at Ethan's email glowing on my phone screen. The number attached to their debt was over $11 million. $11 million. I remember reading it 3 times because my mind refused to accept that my daughter and her husband had buried themselves that deeply without ever telling me the truth. Around me, couples laughed softly over wine while piano music drifted through the room, but I felt completely detached from everything. There is a certain kind of loneliness that only arrives when you realize the people closest to you no longer see you as human. They see you as a solution, a resource, a signature. I went upstairs eventually, but I did not sleep. Around 4 in the morning, I sat on the edge of my hotel bed, holding an old photograph of Caroline that I always carried in my wallet. It was taken during our first harvest season back in 1988. She had dirt on her jeans and purple stains on her hands from crushed grapes. And she was smiling directly at me like building that vineyard together was the greatest adventure in the world. "What happened to our little girl?" I whispered quietly into the dark room. Grief is strange because even after 15 years without Caroline, there were still moments I instinctively expected her beside me. She would have known what to say. She always did. Around sunrise, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was my granddaughter, Sophie. She was 16 then, old enough to notice when adults were lying. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "are you okay?" Just hearing kindness in someone's voice nearly broke me. "I am all right, sweetheart," I answered carefully. "Why are you asking?" There was a pause. Then she whispered, "Mom and Dad have been fighting every night for weeks." I closed my eyes. "You should not have to carry that. Mom keeps saying everything will change once Italy works," Sophie said quietly. "Italy works. Not the trip. Not the family vacation. Works. Like some operation already in progress. Listen to me," I told her gently. "None of this is your fault." "Grandpa?" she asked after another silence. "Are you coming home soon?" I looked around the empty hotel room. "Yeah," I said softly. "I think I need to." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time staring out the window while the city slowly woke beneath gray morning clouds. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not revenge. Awareness. I finally stopped asking myself how to fix everyone else. For years I had spent my life absorbing other people's disasters because I believed that was what fathers were supposed to do. But sitting there alone in Florence, exhausted and emotionally hollow, I realized something painful. The more I sacrificed to rescue Olivia, the less she respected me. Every bailout became permission for another reckless decision. Every act of forgiveness became proof she could push further next time. By the afternoon, the emotional distance between us had become unbearable. Olivia barely looked at me during lunch. Ethan stayed glued to his phone, handling what sounded like frantic financial calls. At one point, I overheard him mutter, "We cannot hold them off much longer." Nobody spoke about family anymore. Nobody mentioned birthdays. The entire illusion had collapsed. That evening, I decided to walk alone through Florence, hoping movement might clear my mind. I crossed narrow stone streets filled with tourists and old cafes until eventually I found myself standing inside a quiet cathedral lit by hundreds of small candles. People sat silently in prayer while soft footsteps echoed across ancient marble floors. I am not an especially religious man, but I sat there for nearly an hour anyway because it was the first peaceful place I had felt since arriving in Italy. An elderly priest eventually sat beside me without speaking for several minutes. Then he looked toward the candles and asked softly, "Family trouble?" I gave a tired laugh. "Is it that obvious?" He smiled gently. "Pain usually is." I stared at the floor before finally admitting something out loud for the first time. "I do not think my daughter sees me as her father anymore." The priest nodded slowly as if he had heard similar heartbreak many times before. Sometimes people become so afraid of losing their future that they destroy the people who gave them one. His words followed me all the way back to the hotel that night. And when I stepped into the lobby, I immediately sensed something had changed because Olivia and Ethan were standing near the staircase waiting for me with expressions so tense and desperate that I knew whatever happened next was going to alter my life forever. When I stepped into the hotel lobby that night, Olivia immediately walked toward me with fast, nervous energy, while Ethan stood near the staircase pretending to stay calm. "Dad, where have you been?" Olivia asked. "Walking," I answered simply. "We need to finish this tonight," Ethan said before I could even remove my coat. There was something different about both of them now. The masks were gone. No more fake smiles. No more family vacation performance. Just desperation hanging in the air like smoke. "I already gave you my answer," I said quietly. Olivia lowered her voice sharply. "You do not understand how serious this is." "Actually," I replied, "I finally do." Her eyes widened slightly. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Ethan glanced toward the empty staircase leading upstairs and muttered, "Maybe we should continue this privately." I looked at my daughter one last time and realized something painful. She was terrified, not of losing me, of losing access to what I owned. And strangely enough, once I fully accepted that truth, my fear began disappearing. The following hours changed everything, but not in the way Olivia expected. What happened on those hotel stairs fractured whatever remained of my old life. Yet it also forced me to stop living as a man controlled by guilt. I spent several days recovering quietly in a small private clinic outside Florence after a hotel employee named Matteo found me and called emergency services. Olivia and Ethan disappeared before authorities arrived. At first, that fact crushed me emotionally. I kept checking my phone expecting some message from my daughter asking whether I survived. None came. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even after the clinic contacted the emergency number listed in my passport. Instead, Daniel arrived from California 42 hours later, looking exhausted and furious. I still remember him standing beside my hospital bed whispering. I knew something was wrong. Neither of us mentioned Olivia immediately. We both sat there in silence listening to distant traffic outside the clinic window. Finally, Daniel asked quietly, "What really happened?" I looked down at the blanket across my legs. "Your sister crossed a line she cannot uncross." Daniel closed his eyes for several seconds like part of him already understood. Back in Napa Valley, life felt strangely unfamiliar when I returned home. Word had spread through parts of our social circle that I was unstable, injured, and stepping away from Vineyard operations. Several distributors had already started contacting Daniel privately asking whether ownership changes were happening. One longtime business partner even asked me gently during a meeting, "Richard, are you sure you are healthy enough to continue leading Harvest this year?" That question stayed with me because I realized how quickly false narratives become reality when repeated often enough. But instead of retreating, I did something I had not done in years. I went back to work completely. Every morning before sunrise, I walked the vineyard rows myself. I met directly with seller staff, reviewed contracts personally, sat through production meetings without delegating everything to attorneys and managers. The workers noticed immediately. One afternoon, an old foreman named Luis handed me a pair of pruning gloves and smiled. "Good to have you back out here again, boss." I had forgotten how much peace existed in simple work. Dirt beneath fingernails. Cold morning fog rolling over grapevines. The smell of oak barrels inside the cellar. No manipulation. No hidden agendas. Just honest labor. Slowly, something inside me started rebuilding itself. Not through revenge. Through clarity. Daniel became my closest ally during those months. We ate dinner together several nights. Each week on the porch, Caroline used to decorate every autumn with lanterns and dried flowers. "You know," Daniel said one evening while pouring 2 glasses of Cabernet, "Mom always worried you gave too much of yourself away." I stared out across the vineyard quietly. I thought sacrificing for family was the right thing to do. Daniel nodded slowly. "It is. But sacrifice stops being love once people start treating it like entitlement." That sentence stayed with me for days. Meanwhile, Olivia remained completely silent. No apology. No explanation. Nothing. The only sign she still existed came through scattered rumors from mutual acquaintances. Debt collectors. Lawsuits. Missed payments. One afternoon, Martin, my attorney, walked into my office carrying a thick folder and closed the door carefully behind him. "Richard," he said quietly, "there is something you need to see." Inside the folder were documents connected to Ethan's financial collapse, including communications that made one thing terrifyingly clear. Italy had never been their backup plan. It had been their last chance before everything exploded. And as I kept reading deeper into those papers, I realized they had underestimated me in one very important way. The documents Martin placed on my desk changed the way I saw my own life. Not because they revealed something new about Olivia and Ethan, but because they forced me to finally see myself clearly. For too long, I had operated like a man slowly disappearing inside his own success. Bennett Hill's Vineyard had become internationally respected over the years, but somewhere along the line, I stopped standing at the center of what I built. I delegated everything, avoided conflict, signed papers without reading carefully enough, trusted people simply because they shared my last name. That version of me ended after Italy. Over the next several months, I rebuilt my role inside the company piece by piece. Not loudly, quietly, deliberately. I converted an old upstairs office overlooking the South Vineyard into my permanent workspace again. The brass nameplate outside the door still read Richard Bennett, founder, although dust had nearly hidden the lettering before I returned. I remember running my fingers across those engraved words the first morning back in that office. Founder, not burden, not obstacle. Founder. Daniel walked in carrying coffee and smiled slightly. "Feels different seeing that." "Light on in here again," he said. I looked around the room at old Harvest photographs lining the walls. I forgot this place belonged to me too. Every day afterward became structured with purpose. I attended distribution meetings personally, reworked vineyard expansion plans, sat beside seller teams during tasting evaluations. Younger employees who barely knew me before suddenly started stopping by my office asking questions about wine production and land management. One afternoon, a 26-year-old harvest coordinator named Emma asked nervously, "Mr. Bennett, how did you know this vineyard would survive in the early years?" I smiled faintly. I did not. I just kept showing up every morning anyway. She wrote that sentence down in her notebook like it mattered. That surprised me. Slowly, my confidence returned through action instead of emotion. By autumn, industry publications started noticing Bennett Hills again after one of our reserve Cabernets received a 98-point rating from a major wine journal. Reporters requested interviews. Investors called. Distribution contracts expanded into new restaurants across Chicago and Seattle. During one interview, a young business reporter asked me, "What is the secret to your longevity in this industry?" I looked directly at him before answering. Do not confuse ownership with stewardship. Land outlives ego every single time. The quote ended up printed in Wine and Vine Monthly beneath a photograph of me standing in the vineyard wearing my old brown field jacket with the Bennett Hills crest stitched above the chest pocket. Daniel framed the magazine cover and hung it outside my office without telling me. "You earned it," he said when I noticed it later. What surprised me most during that season was how calm I became internally. Not numb. Calm. The fear that used to dominate me disappeared once I stopped organizing my life around other people's approval. Some evenings after work, I would walk the property alone at sunset, while rows of vines stretched across golden hills beneath the California sky. Workers waved from tractors. Forklifts moved stacked wine barrels between storage buildings. The vineyard no longer felt like a family battlefield. It felt like home again. Even Sophie started visiting more often. One Saturday, she helped me label reserve bottles inside the cellar while old jazz music played quietly through ceiling speakers. "Mom still thinks you hate her," she said carefully without looking up from the labels. I placed another bottle into its wooden case before answering. "I do not hate your mother." Sophie glanced toward me. "Then what do you feel?" I thought about that question honestly for several seconds. "Sadness," I admitted quietly. "Mostly sadness." Sophie nodded slowly like she understood more than a 16-year-old should have to understand. Before leaving that evening, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I am glad you stayed." Those words stayed with me long after she drove away. Around the same time, Martin finalized major legal restructuring inside the company. New protections, new oversight procedures, everything carefully secured. "Nobody touches this place again without your direct approval," he told me firmly while sliding final documents across my desk. I signed them calmly beneath the brass desk lamp in the office Caroline once helped decorate decades earlier. Outside, the window harvest crews moved beneath bright floodlights preparing for overnight frost protection. Life continued, stronger than before. And then one evening near the start of winter, as rain tapped softly against the vineyard house windows, my phone rang from an unknown number. The moment I heard Olivia's voice again after months of silence, I realized the story was not over yet. The first thing I noticed when Olivia called me that winter night was how quiet she sounded. Gone was the sharp confidence she carried in Florence. Gone was the controlled tone she used whenever she tried steering conversations. All I heard now was exhaustion wrapped tightly around desperation. Rain rolled softly across the vineyard house windows while I stood alone in the kitchen holding my phone. "Dad?" she whispered after several seconds of silence. I leaned against the counter calmly. "That is the first time you have called me in 8 months. Another silence followed. Then she asked quietly, "Can we meet?" I did not answer immediately. The old version of me would have rushed to repair things emotionally. He would have searched for reassurance inside her voice. But that man no longer existed. "Why?" I asked finally. I could hear faint traffic sounds behind her, maybe Los Angeles, maybe San Diego. It no longer mattered. "Because everything is falling apart," she admitted softly. There it was again. Not apology. Collapse. "Where is Ethan?" I asked. Olivia inhaled shakily. "Gone." I closed my eyes briefly. Somehow I was not surprised. Men like Ethan always disappeared once consequences arrived. "Dad, please," she whispered. "I just need to talk to you face to face." We agreed to meet 3 days later at Bennett Hills Vineyard. After the call ended, I stood there for a long time listening to rain hit the roof while emotions moved through me in strange, quiet waves. Anger had faded months ago. What remained was caution. The next morning, Daniel found me sitting in the office reviewing bureau reports. "You look like you did not sleep," he said while setting coffee beside my desk. "Olivia called," I answered. Daniel froze immediately. "What does she want?" "To meet." His jaw tightened. "Absolutely not alone." I looked toward the vineyard through the office windows where workers moved through morning fog between rows of dormant vines. "I am not afraid of her anymore," I said calmly. Daniel sat across from me slowly. "Maybe not, but she is unpredictable when cornered." That sentence lingered heavily in the room because we both knew he was right. Over the following days, tension settled quietly over the Vineyard house. Martin reviewed updated legal protections with me again. Security staff were informed discreetly. Even Sophie called unexpectedly the night before the meeting. "Mom sounds really bad," she said softly. "Bad how?" I asked. "Tired. Scared." I remained silent. Then Sophie added carefully, "I think she thought things would work out differently." I stared at the fireplace glowing across the room. So did I. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and gray. Low winter clouds hung above Napa Valley while wind moved gently through bare vineyard rows. Outside my office windows, I wore the same brown field jacket with the Bennett Hills crest stitched above the pocket that I had worn during harvest interviews earlier that year. Strange how symbols matter sometimes. Months earlier, I felt like a displaced old man inside my own company. Now every inch of the property reflected my authority again. Employees greeted me confidently. Trucks rolled through loading areas under my direction. Contracts, operations, distribution, expansion plans. All of it firmly back in my hands. Around noon, Daniel walked into my office. Her car just came through the front gate. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. That surprised me. I stood calmly and adjusted the cuffs of my shirt. "Where is she?" "Main house driveway." Daniel hesitated before adding quietly, "She is alone." We walked together through the vineyard courtyard while cold air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth and oak barrels from the cellar buildings nearby. Workers glanced toward the driveway curiously before returning to their tasks. Olivia stood beside a black rental SUV wearing a long gray coat with her arms folded tightly against the cold. She looked older somehow. Smaller too. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The last time I had truly looked at my daughter was in Florence before everything shattered. Now she stood in front of the vineyard she nearly destroyed while winter wind lifted strands of blonde hair across her face. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly. "Hello, Olivia." Daniel remained several feet behind me watching carefully. Olivia glanced around the property slowly. "It looks different." "No," I answered calmly. "It looks the way it was always supposed to." Her eyes lowered immediately. We walked toward the main house porch in silence while gravel crunched beneath our shoes. Inside, the fireplace burned softly beside shelves lined with decades of Bennett Hills Reserve bottles. Olivia stopped near the dining room doorway and stared at the framed magazine cover hanging beside my office entrance. "Richard Bennett, founder." She looked at it for several seconds before speaking again. "You really rebuilt everything without me." I met her eyes evenly. "No, Olivia. I rebuilt myself." Her face tightened with emotion then. Not anger this time. Fear. Real fear. Slowly she reached into her handbag and removed a thick envelope with trembling hands. "There is something you do not know," she whispered. And the moment I saw the bank documents inside that envelope, I realized the truth was even worse than I imagined. Olivia stood motionless near the dining room table while rain slid quietly down the vineyard house windows behind her. Her hands trembled as she placed the envelope in front of me. Daniel stayed near the fireplace without speaking, his expression unreadable. I opened the documents slowly and immediately recognized federal bankruptcy filings, creditor notices, and frozen account orders. But buried beneath those papers was something else. A signed cooperation agreement with federal investigators. I looked up at Olivia carefully. "What is this?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Ethan was not just hiding debt. Daniel straightened immediately. "What are you talking about?" Olivia swallowed hard before answering. Some of the investment money was moved illegally through shell companies. Silence settled across the room. I continued reading while the fireplace crackled softly nearby. Wire transfers. Offshore accounts. Fraud investigations. Several names had already been redacted by federal attorneys. Then I reached the final page and saw Ethan's signature beneath a cooperation statement connected to financial crimes involving multiple investors. How long have you known? I asked calmly. Olivia stared at the floor. Since 2 weeks after Italy. Daniel let out a stunned breath. Jesus Christ. I closed the folder carefully and looked at my daughter. And where is Ethan now? Gone, she answered again. He disappeared after the investigators contacted him. Did he take money? Daniel asked sharply. Olivia laughed bitterly at herself. Everything. Her makeup could not hide how exhausted she truly looked anymore. Months earlier, she carried herself like someone trying to force the world into submission. Now she looked like a person who had finally run out of lies to stand on. The bank accounts are frozen, she continued quietly. The house is in foreclosure. The restaurant debts were worse than I told you. And once Ethan started cooperating with investigators, everyone else turned on each other. I leaned back slowly in my chair while studying her face. You came here because you think I can save you again. Olivia looked up quickly. No, I remained silent. A few seconds later, she added softly, at least not financially. That answer surprised me. Daniel crossed his arms carefully. Then why are you here? Olivia glanced around the room at the Vineyard photographs lining the walls before finally meeting my eyes again. Because everything I built collapsed the second I stopped trying to control everyone else. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. Outside, wind moved softly through the vineyard rows beyond the windows. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Why did you really bring me to Italy? Olivia closed her eyes briefly before answering. Because Ethan convinced me that if you transferred the vineyard, we could leverage enough equity to survive before the investigations reached us. And when I refused? I asked calmly. Her face tightened immediately with shame. I panicked. Daniel looked away toward the fireplace while tension thickened across the room again. But strangely, I no longer felt emotionally trapped by any of it. Months earlier, this conversation would have destroyed me. Now I simply listened. You know what the worst part is? Olivia asked quietly after a long silence. I spent years convincing myself you loved the vineyard more than your family. She glanced toward the framed magazine cover beside my office doorway. But standing here now, I finally understand why you protected it. I folded my hands together slowly. Because it was never about money. Olivia nodded faintly while tears gathered in her eyes. It was the only stable thing any of us ever had. That sentence landed heavily inside the room because for the first time since Italy, my daughter was finally speaking honestly instead of strategically. Daniel stepped closer carefully. Why did you not tell us about the investigation sooner? Olivia gave a weak laugh. Because I kept thinking I could still fix everything before anyone found out how bad it really was. I looked at her quietly for several moments before asking one final question. Did you ever intend to tell me the truth in Florence? Olivia's lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. Then she whispered something so quietly I almost did not hear it. No, the honesty of that answer hit harder than anger ever could. Nobody moved. Nobody raised their voice. The room simply fell silent beneath the sound of rain and crackling firewood while years of illusion finally collapsed between us. Then Olivia slowly reached into her handbag again and removed a second envelope I had not noticed before. She slid it carefully across the table toward me. There is one more thing you need to see, she whispered. And the moment I recognized Caroline's handwriting on the front of that sealed envelope, every breath inside my chest suddenly stopped. For several seconds I could not move after seeing Caroline's handwriting on that envelope. The room around me seemed to disappear beneath the sound of rain and the low crackling fire. Olivia sat silently across from me while Daniel slowly stepped closer to the table. My fingers felt strangely unsteady as I opened the seal. Inside was a folded letter dated 6 months before Caroline died. I recognized the pale blue stationery immediately because she used to keep it inside the top drawer of her writing desk upstairs. The first line alone nearly broke me. Richard, if you are reading this one day, it means our children may already be hurting each other. I swallowed hard and continued reading while the room remained completely silent. Caroline wrote about Olivia's fear of abandonment after her diagnosis, about Daniel becoming emotionally protective too early, about her own worry that grief would distort our family if we stopped speaking honestly to one another. But near the end of the letter, her words shifted into something far more direct. Do not confuse rescuing people with loving them, she wrote. Sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is refuse to become the foundation for another person's destruction. I closed my eyes briefly. Even after all those years, Caroline somehow still understood me better than anyone alive. Daniel finally spoke softly from beside the fireplace. Mom wrote that before she died. Olivia nodded faintly. She gave it to me during her last month at home. I looked up sharply. You had this all these years? Tears rolled silently down Olivia's face now. She told me to give it to you if our family ever reached a point where nobody could recognize each other anymore. The weight of that sentence settled heavily over all of us. For years that letter sat hidden somewhere, while resentment quietly poisoned our lives. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope before speaking again. Why now? Olivia stared down at her hands. Because I finally realized Mom was right. Daniel pulled out a chair slowly and sat down across from us. Nobody looked angry anymore. Just exhausted. Deeply exhausted. Outside, wind moved softly through the vineyard while lights from the cellar buildings glowed faintly through the rain. What happens now? Olivia asked quietly after a long silence. I leaned back in my chair and looked at both of my children carefully. Now we tell the truth, I answered calmly. Olivia nodded slightly. The investigators are already contacting extended family and business associates. People are going to hear things. Then they hear the truth, I said. Not another manufactured story. Daniel studied me for a moment before asking, what about the company? The company stays protected, I answered firmly. That part is not negotiable. Olivia lowered her eyes immediately. I know. There was no argument in her voice anymore. No strategy. Just acceptance. I stood slowly and walked toward the office doorway where the framed magazine cover still hung beneath the hallway light. Richard Bennett, founder. Strange how much those words meant now compared to a year earlier. I turned back toward my children. I spent too many years confusing silence with peace, I said quietly. That ends now. Olivia wiped her face carefully. Are you cutting me out completely? The old version of me would have answered emotionally. This version answered honestly. I am setting boundaries that should have existed years ago. She nodded once like she expected that answer. Does Sophie know everything? I asked. Olivia hesitated. Not everything. She deserves honesty too, I said firmly. Not protection built from lies. Daniel looked toward his sister carefully before speaking for the first time in several minutes. You need help, Liv. Real help. Not another bailout. Olivia gave a weak laugh through tears. I know. And for the first time in years, I believed she actually did. The evening slowly settled into an uneasy calm after that. No dramatic reconciliation. No perfect forgiveness. Just three exhausted people sitting inside a Vineyard house, surrounded by consequences that could no longer be avoided. Eventually, Olivia stood near the front door preparing to leave, while rain continued falling outside beneath the porch lights. Before stepping out, she turned toward me quietly. Dad, yes. Her voice nearly disappeared when she spoke. I do not think I ever really understood what you built here until I destroyed my own life trying to take it. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then maybe this is the first honest thing we have both had in years. Olivia nodded slowly and walked out into the rain. I watched her taillights disappear down the Vineyard road while something inside my chest remained unresolved. Because even though the lies had finally ended, grief still lingered in places truth could not fully repair. Winter eventually gave way to spring in Napa Valley. And for the first time in many years, the Vineyard felt peaceful instead of heavy. Not perfect. Peaceful. There is a difference. The legal investigations surrounding Ethan continued for months, and several financial firms eventually collapsed alongside the fraud network he had attached himself to. Olivia moved into a small rental home nearly 40 miles away and quietly began rebuilding her life from the ground up. No luxury cars. No investment schemes. No pretending. Just ordinary work, therapy appointments, and long difficult days learning how to live honestly again. We did not magically become the perfect family after that winter. Real life does not work that way. Some wounds close slowly. Some conversations still carry silence inside them. But over time, small things began changing. Sophie started visiting every Sunday afternoon. Daniel laughed more. Even Olivia eventually returned to the Vineyard one morning during harvest season wearing jeans, work boots, and no makeup, asking quietly, "Do you still need extra hands today?" I looked at her for a long moment before handing her a pair of pruning gloves. Row 12, I said calmly. The Cabernet vines near the south fence. She nodded once and walked into the morning fog without another word. Sometimes healing begins exactly like that. Not with speeches. With work. With humility. With showing up differently than before. Months later, we held a private family dinner on the back porch overlooking the vineyard at sunset. No lawyers. No contracts. No hidden pressure sitting underneath the table. Just warm bread, roasted vegetables, old jazz music from a small speaker, and the sound of wind moving softly through the vines Caroline once loved so much. At one point, Sophie raised her wine glass filled with sparkling cider and smiled at me. "Grandpa," she said, "you seem lighter now." I looked out across the rows of grapevines glowing gold beneath the California evening sky. I think I finally stopped carrying things that were never mine to carry. Nobody spoke after that because everybody at the table understood exactly what I meant. Later that night, after everyone left, I walked alone through the vineyard carrying the old blue envelope with Caroline's letter still inside. I stopped near the southern edge of the property where she and I planted the very first vines together almost 4 decades earlier. The wooden posts had been replaced over the years, but the roots beneath the soil remained the same. That always stayed with me. Healthy roots survive brutal seasons. I stood there beneath the stars listening to distant insects hum across the valley while thinking about everything this family survived and nearly destroyed. And honestly, the greatest lesson was not about betrayal. It was about boundaries. About understanding that love without limits eventually becomes permission for dysfunction. For most of my life, I believe being a good father meant sacrificing endlessly, fixing every crisis, protecting everyone from consequences. But real love does not erase accountability. Real love tells the truth even when it hurts. Real love refuses to lose itself just to keep others comfortable. If somebody listening to my story right now feels trapped inside manipulation, guilt, family pressure, or emotional exhaustion, I want you to hear me clearly. Protecting your peace does not make you cruel. Saying no does not make you selfish. And rebuilding yourself after betrayal is not revenge. It is survival. Sometimes God, or life, or whatever greater force you believe in, allows painful truths to surface because the version of you hiding beneath all that fear deserves a chance to breathe again. I wish I had understood that earlier. I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner. But maybe wisdom only arrives after enough heartbreak forces us to finally pay attention. These days my mornings begin before sunrise with coffee on the vineyard porch while fog rolls gently over the hills. I still wear the old brown field jacket with the Bennett Hills crest stitched above the pocket. The brass nameplate outside my office still reads Founder. But the thing I value most now is not the land, the business, or even the success. It is the quiet feeling of no longer abandoning myself to keep other people happy. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 72 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let guilt convince you to surrender the parts of yourself that took a lifetime to build. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Truly, if any part of it spoke to your heart, I hope it reminds you that you are not weak for feeling hurt, and you are not alone in trying to heal from people you once trusted completely. Life can still grow something beautiful after betrayal if you are willing to protect what matters and rebuild honestly from the roots up. And before I went back inside that night, I placed Caroline's letter carefully into the wooden box where we kept our very first Vineyard records all those years ago. The same box still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Then I poured one final glass of Cabernet, stood quietly beneath the porch light, and realized peace does not arrive when everything becomes perfect. Peace arrives the moment you finally stop betraying yourself. If you are still here listening, I would love to know where you are watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you most deeply. And if stories like this bring you comfort, reflection, or even a little strength during difficult seasons of life, you are always welcome here. There are more stories waiting in this playlist. More families, more hidden truths, more people learning, sometimes painfully, how to reclaim themselves after life changes everything. And maybe somewhere in one of those stories, you will recognize a piece of your own journey too.